Have you ever imagined this scene? Just 30 minutes after the divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse with empty hands. After 3 years as a daughter-in-law in a wealthy family, I was leaving like an outcast. My ex-husband turned his back on me coldly. My sister-in-law scoffed, and my mother-in-law was so gleeful that as she got into her car, she shouted a sentence so bitter it stung anyone who heard it. Finally, that little freeloader is out of our house. From now on, that $25 million is all ours. Hearing that, I remained silent. I didn't argue, didn't explain, just stood quietly across the street, watching them laugh and chat as if they had just won the biggest gamble of their lives. But exactly 30 minutes after the divorce decree was issued, my mother-in-law's phone suddenly rang. She answered it excitedly, assuming it was the bank, calling to confirm the large withdrawal she had planned for a new mansion. But just a few seconds later, her face turned deathly pale, the phone trembled in her hand, and she screamed a sentence in the middle of the parking lot that left her entire family frozen in shock. What? The $25 million is gone from the account? At that moment, I just watched them from a distance, and for the first time in 3 years, I smiled. Because there was a secret they never knew. The $25 million they thought was theirs had never belonged to them in the first place. And the only person with the right to decide its fate was me. That afternoon, the New York City sky was a pale gray. There was no rain, but the air was heavy, as if a great storm was about to break. On the front steps of the New York County Supreme Courthouse, people moved in a constant stream. The murmur of conversations, the sounds of traffic, and the hurried footsteps blended into a chaotic symphony. I descended the stone steps one by one, a freshly stamped divorce decree in my hand. It was just a thin piece of paper, but it closed the chapter on 3 years of a marriage I once thought would be my entire life. 3 years ago, I had walked into the Hayes family with a heart full of hope. 3 years later, I was leaving with a small handbag, a few personal documents, and a heart so weary it no longer had the strength to feel more pain. I paused at the bottom of the steps, taking a deep breath, the cool, dry autumn air bit at my face and throat. Behind me, the courthouse doors opened again. The familiar click of high heels echoed on the stone. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose mere presence from afar had, for the past 3 years, forced me to remind myself to endure, to be silent, to swallow every grievance. But today, I didn't turn. I just stood still. A few seconds later, her voice rang out from behind me, sharp, clear, and full of triumph. "Well, it's finally done. I told you. A barren woman like you would be kicked out of this family sooner or later." A few people nearby glanced over. I still didn't turn. She walked right up beside me, the familiar scent of her expensive perfume wafting past. "What are you still standing here for? Waiting for someone to pity you?" She sneered. "Or are you planning to go back and beg Ethan?" I slowly turned to look at her. For 3 years, I had always bowed my head to her. But today, for the first time, I looked directly into her eyes. Her gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, as if she was unaccustomed to me no longer appearing weak. But a moment later, she laughed again. "What are you looking at? You've lost the right to be a daughter-in-law, and now you want to show some attitude?" Just then, Ethan, my ex-husband, walked out of the courthouse. He wore a crisp white shirt, holding his phone, his expression as cold as if the entire ordeal had been a simple administrative procedure. 3 years ago, I had loved this man so much, I thought I could endure anything as long as I had him by my side. But 3 years later, I understood that when love fades, some people become colder than strangers. Ethan stopped in front of me. He looked at me for a few seconds, then spoke with unnerving calm. "Don't come back to the house anymore." I let out a small, bitter laugh. In 3 years of living in that mansion, not once did I feel it was a home. I replied softly, "Don't worry, I have no intention of coming back." Hearing this, my sister-in-law, Chloe, who was standing behind them, burst out laughing. "Did you hear that, Mom? She still has her pride." She crossed her arms, scanning me from head to toe. "You must have saved up a nice little nest egg after 3 years of living off us, huh?" My mother-in-law shot me a disdainful look. "Did you really think you could walk into the Hayes family and get a piece of the fortune?" She laughed loudly. "Let me tell you, from the spoon you ate with to the chair you sat on, it was all paid for with our money. The moment you walk out that door, you have nothing." A few bystanders began to whisper among themselves, but I remained silent, not refuting, not angry, just watching them quietly. My silence only made Eleanor more smug. She turned to Ethan and said loudly, "See, son, I told you. This type of woman is only good at playing the victim." Then she cackled. "It's a good thing we divorced her early. Otherwise, she'd be trying to claim a piece of our 25 million. Hearing that figure, several people nearby turned to stare, but she didn't care. She was too happy, too triumphant, too confident in her victory. Ethan gently tugged at her arm. "Mom, that's enough." But she wasn't finished. "Enough of what? We need to make things clear today." She turned back to me, her eyes like daggers. "Listen carefully. Now that you're divorced, the entire $25 million investment fund belongs completely to the Hayes family." She held her head high. "It has nothing to do with you anymore." I listened and then gave a slight nod. "Is that so?" She frowned, likely expecting me to cry or at least react, but I only said one thing, very softly. "Congratulations." Hearing me, Chloe burst into laughter. "Mom, see? She's even polite enough to congratulate us." My mother-in-law joined in the laughter. "Yes, you should congratulate us." She looked at me with mock pity. "Because from now on, you're going to learn what it feels like to live with no money, no husband, and no one to lean on." I didn't reply. I just looked at the gleaming black Mercedes S-Class parked at the curb. The chauffeur was already holding the door open. Eleanor walked over, speaking loudly to her daughter as she went. "Let's go. Today, I have to stop by the bank to confirm the funds." Her voice was giddy with excitement. "Then we'll go look at that $5 million estate in the Hamptons I like so much." Chloe squealed. "Really, Mom?" Her mother laughed heartily. "With 25 million in hand, what's one little mansion?" All three of them got into the car. The door shut with a solid thud. The Mercedes slowly pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of traffic. I stood there, watching it go. The afternoon wind gently rustled my hair. The phone in my pocket buzzed. I took it out. It was a text from the bank. The message was just a single line. "The asset protection clause has been activated as per the terms following the finalization of the divorce proceedings." I stared at the words for a long time, then a small smile touched my lips. Somewhere in this city, perhaps in just a few minutes, my mother-in-law's phone would also ring, and that call would make the entire Hayes family realize a truth they had never imagined. A truth that, for 3 long years, I had never spoken aloud. The gleaming black Mercedes moved away from the courthouse, merging into the heavy afternoon traffic of Manhattan. The slanted sunlight reflected off the car's windows, illuminating Eleanor Hayes's beaming face. She hadn't felt this relieved in 3 years. Leaning back against the plush leather seat, she crossed her arms and smiled with deep satisfaction. We finally got rid of her. Beside her, Chloe, Ethan's sister, giggled. "I told you, Mom." "She looks innocent, but I'm sure she was after our money." Eleanor smirked. "She can be after it all she wants, but that doesn't mean she'll get it." She glanced at her son, sitting in the front passenger seat. "Good thing you were decisive and ended it quickly." Ethan said nothing, merely staring out the window, his expression somber. For some reason, he felt a strange emptiness inside. Not happiness, not relief, just a void. 3 years ago, when he had married Ava Thompson, he thought it would be a simple marriage. She was a gentle, quiet girl from an ordinary family, someone who wouldn't cause any trouble. But 3 years later, it all ended so quickly that he hadn't even had time to process what he had gained or lost. Eleanor suddenly clapped her hands. "Oh, that's right." She turned to the driver. "Head straight to the J.P. Morgan branch on Park Avenue." Chloe was surprised. "Why are we going to the bank, Mom, Eleanor beamed. To access the money, of course. Her voice was filled with excitement. That $25 million has been sitting in the investment fund for 3 years. Now that the divorce is final, we have full control. She spoke as if she had just won a great war. We'll confirm it right away and put a deposit down on that Hamptons estate. Chloe's eyes widened. The $5 million one? That's the one. Eleanor nodded firmly. It's in a prime location, has a huge garden, and it's near the water. When we find a new wife for Ethan, they'll need a home that reflects their status. Hearing this, Ethan frowned slightly. Let's worry about that later, Mom. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively. Later, a man needs to marry and have children. Then, she lowered her voice, speaking as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. This time, I'll choose carefully. She must come from a family of equal standing. She scoffed. Not some penniless nobody like the one we just got rid of. The car pulled up in front of the towering J.P. Morgan building, a sleek glass skyscraper in the heart of Midtown. The three of them stepped out, and a doorman immediately opened the door. Inside, the bank was cool and brightly lit with white light. Eleanor strode directly to the VIP private banking section. "Hello," she said to the receptionist. "I'd like to see the manager of our investment account." The receptionist smiled politely. "Of course, ma'am. May I have your name?" "Eleanor Hayes." Hearing the name, the young woman nodded immediately. "Please wait just a moment, Mrs. Hayes." A few minutes later, a well-dressed man in his 40s appeared. "Mrs. Hayes, welcome." He shook her hand politely. "I'm Mr. Davies, your senior client advisor." Eleanor nodded. "Let's talk in your office." The three of them were escorted into a private meeting room. Tea was served, but Eleanor didn't touch it. She placed her designer handbag firmly on the table and got straight to the point. "I'm here to confirm our full control of the family's investment fund." Her voice was thick with confidence. "The $25 million one." Mr. Davies paused for a second. "The Hayes Enterprises GP fund, correct?" "Yes." Eleanor confirmed. "My son and daughter-in-law divorced today." She gave a slight smile. "The binding clause is no longer in effect," Chloe interjected. "That means the money is now completely ours." Mr. Davies looked at them for a few seconds, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Yes, I understand." He opened his laptop, his fingers tapping lightly on the keyboard. The room was quiet for a few moments before he suddenly stopped, his brow furrowed. Eleanor frowned. "Is there a problem?" "Mr." Davies stared at the screen for another few seconds, then turned to them, his voice becoming very cautious. "I apologize, but would you mind if I double-check something?" Eleanor was growing impatient. "What is there to check? This account has been with you for 3 years," Chloe added with a toss of her head. "That's right. It should be a simple confirmation." But Mr. Davies stood up. "Please excuse me for a few minutes." The door closed, and an unusual quiet fell over the room. Eleanor crossed her arms. "For such a big bank, their service is terribly slow." Chloe giggled. "They're probably trembling at the sight of such a large sum of money." The two of them laughed. Only Ethan remained silent. He looked around the luxurious glass-walled room, a vague sense of unease beginning to form within him. About 5 minutes later, the door opened. Mr. Davies returned, but this time he was accompanied by another woman in her late 30s, dressed in a sharp black suit, with an intelligent, discerning gaze. Mr. Davies made the introduction. "This is Miss Albright, our bank's legal counsel." Hearing the word lawyer, Eleanor's expression soured instantly. "A lawyer? For what?" Her tone became sharp. "I'm here to access my funds, not to file a lawsuit." Miss Albright sat down and opened a file in front of her. "We just need to confirm a few details." She looked directly at Eleanor. "You just stated that your son has finalized his divorce from Miss Ava Thompson today. Is that correct?" "Yes. It's officially effective." "Correct." Miss Albright nodded slowly. Then she said something very quietly, but the words seemed to freeze the air in the room. "In that case, the asset protection clause has been activated." Eleanor frowned. "What clause?" Miss Albright turned a page in the file. Clause 7 inches the investment fund agreement. Her voice was clear, articulating every word. In the event that Miss Ava Thompson is subjected to a forced divorce or her marital relationship with the Hayes family is terminated, the entire sum within the fund will be immediately frozen, and control will revert to the designated representative of the original benefactor. The room fell silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Eleanor burst out laughing. "What are you talking about?" Miss Albright closed the file, her expression calm. She paused for effect, then stated clearly, "The $25 million is no longer under your family's control." The teacup on the table rattled. Chloe shot to her feet. "What?" Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. "Impossible!" Miss Albright looked at them with an expression of regret. Then she delivered the final blow, a sentence that left the Hayes family utterly stunned. Because the person with the right to control that money, from the very beginning, was never the Hayes family. She paused, her gaze sharp. It was Ava Thompson. Ethan stood frozen. A ringing filled his ears, and a single thought raced through his mind. Impossible. For 3 years, he had believed his wife was just an ordinary girl, a fragile woman, someone who had nothing. But if what the bank was saying was true, then who was the woman he had just divorced? The VIP room at the bank became utterly silent. The laughter and smugness from moments before had vanished, replaced by a tension so thick you could hear the hum of the air conditioning overhead. Eleanor Hayes stood frozen, her hands pressed against the glass tabletop, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the lawyer, Miss Albright. What did you just say?" Her voice trembled with rage. "The $25 million doesn't belong to my family?" Miss Albright's expression remained unchanged. She simply pushed the file towards Eleanor. "You can review Clause 7 yourself." Eleanor snatched the file, flipping through the pages so quickly they rustled. With every line she read, her face grew paler. Chloe leaned over her shoulder to look, and after a few seconds, she shrieked, "This can't be!" She pointed at a line on the page. "It clearly says here, the Hayes Enterprises Investment Fund." Miss Albright nodded. "Correct. The fund is named after Hayes Enterprises." She paused, then continued. "But the original capital came from another investor." A heavy silence filled the room again. Ethan, standing behind them, felt a chill run down his spine, his eyes fixed on the document. "Another investor." Miss Albright looked at him. "That's right." She turned to another page. 3 years ago, when Hayes Enterprises faced a financial crisis after a disastrous real estate deal, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. At the mention of this, Ethan clenched his fists. He remembered, 3 years ago, the company had nearly collapsed. It was also the exact time he had married Ava, but at the time, his father had said he found a source of funding to save the company. Ethan had never asked for details. Miss Albright continued. An investor provided $25 million to rescue the company. She looked directly at them. That money was placed into an investment fund under the name Hayes Enterprises. Chloe immediately cut in. "So the money belongs to us, Miss." Albright shook her head slightly. "No, it was a trust fund." She enunciated each word slowly. Hayes Enterprises only had the right to use the capital for business operations. The actual ownership remained with the investor. The room was quiet for another few seconds before Eleanor slammed her hand on the table again. "Then who is this investor?" Miss Albright looked directly into her eyes. "The legal representative of that investment." She paused, then said with absolute clarity, "Is Ava Thompson." The words fell like a thunderclap. Chloe stumbled back a step. "No way." Eleanor shook her head repeatedly. "No, impossible." Her voice was nearly a scream. "That girl is dirt poor. Her family could never have $25 million. Miss Albright didn't react to her outburst. She simply said, "The funds do not belong to Miss Thompson personally." She opened another file. "It is an investment from the Thompson Capital Fund." Ethan suddenly frowned. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Then, it hit him. Thompson Capital, a massive private equity firm known for rescuing struggling businesses. But that firm belonged to the reclusive Thompson family, a dynasty known for its immense wealth and privacy. Ethan stared at the lawyer. "Are you saying," he swallowed hard, "that Ava Thompson is connected to that fund?" Miss Albright gave a slight nod. "She is the legal heir." The air in the room seemed to solidify. Eleanor stood speechless. Chloe's jaw dropped. Only Ethan stood motionless, but 100 memories were flooding his mind. 3 years ago, the first time he met Ava. She was wearing a simple white dress, minimal makeup, and spoke softly. He had asked her what her family did. She just smiled and said, "My family is in business, just a small one." He hadn't pressed further, assuming she was from a middle-class family. But now, if what the bank was saying was true, the woman he had lived with for 3 years was the heiress to a multi-million-dollar investment fund. Ethan felt his heart pound, a vague sense of regret spreading through his chest. Eleanor, still in denial, lunged towards the table, pointing at the lawyer. "I don't believe you," she practically shrieked. "That girl was my daughter-in-law for 3 years. I know her better than anyone." Miss Albright looked at her with a calm, almost pitying gaze. "You know her?" She gave a faint smile. "If you truly knew her," she pushed a single sheet of paper across the table, "perhaps you wouldn't have been in such a hurry to force her into a divorce." Eleanor looked down at the paper. It was a copy of the investment contract. In the bottom corner was a small line of text, "Legal representative, Ava Thompson." Her hand trembled, and the paper fluttered onto the table. Chloe stammered. So what about the 25 million now?" Miss Albright's answer was simple. "It has been frozen." She added one more sentence, a sentence that sent the entire Hayes family plunging into an abyss. "And full control has been transferred back to Miss Thompson." Ethan stood in silence, his mind reeling. Just an hour ago, he thought he had escaped a meaningless marriage. But now, he was beginning to understand. The woman whose divorce papers he had just signed might have been the very person who had secretly saved his family's company 3 years ago. And Eleanor, the woman who had laughed triumphantly outside the courthouse, was now completely broken. She collapsed into a chair, muttering to herself, "Impossible! Impossible!" But the truth was undeniable. The $25 million not only didn't belong to them, but it was now entirely in the hands of the daughter-in-law they had just cast out. The oppressive silence in the bank's VIP room continued. After Miss Albright delivered her final statement, no one spoke. There was only the soft hum of the air conditioner and the slight rustle of papers on the table. Eleanor Hayes sat frozen in her chair, her face ashen, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. For over 20 years, she had been accustomed to people obeying her, to having money and power firmly within her family's grasp. But today, for the first time, she felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "No," she shook her head repeatedly. "It can't be." Chloe, standing beside her, was equally panicked. "Ethan, say something." But Ethan remained still, his gaze fixed on the contract on the table, the bold print still there. "Legal representative, Ava Thompson." He read the name over and over, a name he had called every day for 3 years. A woman who had slept beside him, eaten with him, lived with him. But now he realized he had probably never truly known her. Gay, Miss Albright closed her file. "We have provided all the necessary information." Her voice was calm. "If your family has no further questions, we will conclude this meeting." Chloe immediately shouted, "Conclude what?" She pointed a finger at the lawyer. "That 25 million is our company's money. You can't just take it." Miss Albright looked at her, her gaze unwavering. "We are not taking anything," she said slowly. "We are simply returning it to its rightful owner." Chloe was speechless. Eleanor, however, suddenly shot to her feet, knocking her chair over with a loud crash. "No!" she screamed. "That girl can't have the right to take my family's money." Miss Albright sighed softly. "Mrs. Hayes." She looked directly into her eyes. "Perhaps you should recall something. 3 years ago, your own family signed the contract, accepting this investment capital. She opened the file and pointed to a signature. This is your husband's signature. Eleanor looked down. The familiar signature of Mr. Hayes, her husband, was clearly on the page. Back then, the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. No one would invest, no one would help. Then, a mysterious investment fund appeared with $25 million, a sum large enough to save the entire company. The Hayes family had been so overjoyed at the time that they hadn't bothered with the complex clauses as long as the company survived. But they didn't know the fund had a special provision, one known only to 3 parties: the bank, the lawyers, and Ava Thompson. Miss Albright stood up. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes," she spoke very gently, "but from now on, your family no longer has the right to use those funds." With that, she walked out of the room. The door closed, and the room fell back into a heavy silence. Chloe turned to her mother. "Mom, what do we do now?" Eleanor didn't answer, her eyes vacant. After a moment, she abruptly stood up. "Let's go." Her voice became sharp. "We have to find her." Ethan looked up. "You mean Ava Thompson?" She gritted her teeth. "She can't have gone far." She clutched her handbag tightly. She has to explain this. Chloe nodded repeatedly. "That's right, Mom. I bet she's been hiding this for 3 years. But Ethan remained still. He said nothing, just stared out the glass window. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to soften. A memory suddenly surfaced. 3 years ago, on the day he proposed to Ava, she had asked him only one question. "Are you sure you want to marry me?" He had laughed. "Why wouldn't I be?" She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "If you find out later that I'm not who you think I am, will you regret it?" At the time, he hadn't understood the question. He had just smiled. "All I need is you." But now, Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Perhaps the one with the most regret right now was him. Eleanor turned to him. "Ethan, what are you standing there for? Go find her." Ethan slowly nodded. The 3 of them hurried out of the bank. The Mercedes was once again navigating the crowded streets, but this time, there was no laughter, no triumph, only panic, because they had just realized something. The daughter-in-law they had scorned for 3 years might be the very person holding the fate of the entire Hayes family in her hands. But when their car returned to the courthouse, Ava Thompson was gone. The coffee shop across the street was empty. No one knew where she had gone, and no one knew what she would do next. Only one thing was certain. From this moment on, the game had completely changed, and the one in control was no longer the Hayes family. The Mercedes screeched to a halt in front of the courthouse, and the door flew open. Eleanor Hayes practically fell out, her face stripped of its usual arrogance, her hair slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with panic. Where is she? She scanned the area. The courthouse entrance was still busy, but Ava Thompson was nowhere in sight. Chloe ran to the coffee shop across the street, pushed open the door, and her eyes darted around. "Excuse me, was there a young woman in a white blouse sitting here a little while ago?" The barista nodded. "Yes, there was. Where is she now?" "She left." Chloe spun around and looked at her mother. "She's gone." Eleanor stood frozen. "Gone where?" The barista shook his head. "I don't know. I just saw her take a phone call and leave." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Damn it." Ethan stood behind them, silent. He looked at the empty chair by the window. The iced tea on the table was untouched. The ice cubes nearly melted, proof that she had just left not long ago. A strange feeling of loss washed over him. In 3 years of living together, he had never truly paid attention to her, never asked what she liked to drink, never noticed where she liked to sit. But now, looking at that empty chair, he felt as if he had missed something profoundly important. Eleanor turned to her son. "Ethan, what are you waiting for? Call her." Ethan took out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He found Ava's number in his contacts. For 3 years, that name had always been at the top of his list, but today, he felt like he was calling a complete stranger. The call went through. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then, "The number you have dialed is not available at this time." The cold, automated voice echoed. Ethan ended the call. Chloe was frustrated. She probably turned her phone off. Eleanor gritted her teeth. That girl definitely hid this from the start. She turned to Ethan. "I want you to have someone look into her, right now." Ethan was silent for a second. Then he nodded. "Okay." An hour later, in the executive office of Hayes Enterprises, Ethan sat at his desk. The computer screen was filled with documents that had just been sent to him. Beside him stood Mark, his trusted assistant. Mark placed a file on the desk. "Mr. Hayes." His voice was hesitant. "I did a preliminary background check on Miss Thompson." Ethan looked up. "And?" Mark took a breath. "There are a few surprises." Eleanor immediately stepped forward. "What kind of surprises?" Mark opened the file. The first page had a single line in large font, "Thompson Capital." Eleanor frowned. "What is that?" Mark looked at her. "It's one of the largest private equity firms in the country." Chloe scoffed. "So what?" Mark turned to the next page. In the center was a photograph of an older man in a suit with a stern expression. Beneath the photo was a name. David Thompson, founder of Thompson Capital. Ethan stared at the picture. Suddenly, he remembered. 3 years ago, on his wedding day, an elderly man had attended. He had stood at a distance, watching Ava for a long time. Later, he shook Ethan's hand and said only one thing: "Take good care of her." At the time, Ethan had thought he was just a distant relative. But now, Mark turned to the next page. David Thompson has one granddaughter. He placed his finger on the next photo. Ethan leaned in to look. It was Ava. She was standing in the middle of a business conference, the Thompson Capital logo prominent on the banner behind her. Ethan shot to his feet. "What?" Mark spoke slowly. "Miss Ava Thompson is the sole heir to Thompson Capital." The entire room fell silent. Chloe stammered. "That's impossible. For 3 years, she acted like a housewife. She even went grocery shopping and cooked for us." Mark sighed. Perhaps that was intentional. Ethan's mind was spinning. 3 years. For 3 years, he had let the heiress of a billion-dollar investment firm cook his meals, clean his house, and endure the contempt of his mother. A heavy feeling of regret settled in his chest. Eleanor, still not convinced, snatched the file. Impossible. But when she flipped to the last page, she froze. There was a copy of the inheritance documents, the name of the beneficiary, Ava Thompson, the estimated value of the assets, over $800 million. Her hand trembled, and the file slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor. Chloe stammered. "So, for the past 3 years, we've been treating an heiress worth almost $1 billion. Like a maid?" No one answered. Only Ethan stood silently. A single thought consumed him. He had just divorced the woman who could have changed his entire life. And worse, he had been the one to push her away. At that same moment, in another part of the city, a black Maybach pulled up in front of a modern skyscraper. The door opened, and Ava Thompson stepped out. A man in a suit bowed his head. "Welcome, Miss Thompson." Ava gave a slight nod. "Is everything ready?" The man smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He handed her a tablet. Hayes Enterprises is about to enter a difficult phase. Ava looked up at the building before her, her expression calm. 3 years as a daughter-in-law, 3 years of endurance. She had never intended to seek revenge. But some people only understand the value of what they had after they've lost everything. She spoke softly, a single sentence hanging in the air. This is only the beginning. The next morning, the headquarters of Hayes Enterprises was in chaos. Accountants scurried between departments, desk phones rang incessantly, and department heads gathered outside the conference room with tense expressions. Inside the CEO's office, Ethan sat before his computer, the screen filled with red-flagged emails. He read each line, his face growing darker by the second. Suddenly, the door burst open. His assistant, Mark, rushed in, looking more serious than ever. "Mr. Hayes," his voice was hoarse. We have a problem. Ethan looked up. What is it? Mark placed a folder on the desk. Grand Sterling Bank just sent a notice. The company's $50 million revolving line of credit has been suspended. Ethan frowned. The reason? Mark took a breath. Because the $25 million investment fund has been frozen. The room fell silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Ethan clenched his fist. They suspended our credit just for that? Mark shook his head. That's not all. He opened another email. Northwood Bank also just announced they're halting our credit limit, and 3 of our real estate partners have sent letters demanding early payment on their contracts. Ethan shot to his feet. What? Mark looked at him. You know how it is, sir. For the past 3 years, most of the company's cash flow has revolved around that $25 million fund. Now that we've lost access to it, he trailed off. The entire financial structure of Hayes Enterprises is starting to collapse. The words hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. He stood frozen, never imagining things could get this serious so quickly. For 3 years, the company had grown rapidly, expanding with new projects. But now he realized it was all built on a foundation he never truly understood. That $25 million, a sum his family had always assumed was theirs, was in reality just temporary capital. Mark spoke quietly. If we don't find a new source of funding within 2 months, he didn't finish, but Ethan understood. The company could go bankrupt. At the same time, in the Hayes family mansion, Eleanor was pacing back and forth in the living room. The coffee table was littered with documents and her phone. She had just finished a call. What? She had screamed into the phone. You're cutting us off too? After a brief response from the other end, her anger grew. We've been doing business together for 10 years. You can't just turn your back on us now. But a few seconds later, she lowered the phone. The call had been disconnected. Chloe sat on the sofa, her face pale. How did it go, Mom? Eleanor didn't answer. She just collapsed into a chair, beads of sweat on her forehead. In over 20 years, she had never seen things this bad. In the past, whenever the company faced difficulties, there was always a cash infusion from the investment fund. But now, that lifeline was gone. Chloe's voice trembled. Mom, is this because of Ava? Eleanor gritted her teeth. Who else could it be? She slammed her hand on the table. That girl is doing this on purpose. But as she said it, she fell silent. A terrifying thought crept into her mind. If Ava had known everything from the beginning, then why did she endure 3 years of mistreatment in their home? A chill ran down her spine. That evening, Ethan came home late. As he walked into the living room, Eleanor immediately stood up. How is the company? Ethan loosened his tie. Not good. Just 2 words, but they were enough to make Eleanor's face drain of color. Chloe asked worriedly, Is it really that serious? Ethan looked at them and spoke bluntly. If we don't secure new capital within 60 days, the company will go bankrupt. The room felt like it had been frozen in time. Chloe was terrified. No, that can't be. Eleanor's voice shook. So what do we do now? Ethan was silent. After a long moment, he said, There's only one way. His mother and sister looked at him. What way? Ethan looked down at the table, his voice low. We have to find Ava. Chloe immediately objected. Find her? For what? But Eleanor said nothing. She understood. If the investment fund belonged to Ava, then the only person who could save their company was her. She clenched her fists. A proud woman like her had never imagined a day when she would have to beg her former daughter-in-law, but now it seemed she had no other choice. That night, in a luxurious office building downtown, Ava stood before a large window, the glittering lights of the city spread out below her. The man standing behind her spoke softly. Miss Thompson, Hayes Enterprises has entered a state of crisis. Ava didn't turn around. She just watched the streams of traffic below. 3 years ago, she had walked into the Hayes family hoping for a peaceful life. 3 years later, she left with a heart that had been completely transformed. The man asked, Shall we proceed with the next phase? Ava smiled faintly, a calm, measured smile. There's no need, she said softly. We just have to stand still. They'll collapse on their own. At the same time, in the Hayes mansion, Eleanor sat in the darkened living room. She stared at her phone, and then, with a trembling hand, she dialed a number she never thought she would call in 3 years. On the other end, Ava Thompson's phone began to ring. That night, the lights were on in the Hayes family mansion, but the atmosphere was far from warm. The spacious, opulent living room, with its imported Italian sofa, felt strangely cold. Eleanor Hayes sat alone, her phone in front of her, the screen illuminated with a name she had never proactively called in 3 years, Ava Thompson. She stared at the name for a long time. In the 3 years Ava was her daughter-in-law, it was always Ava who called her first, asking if she needed anything, what she wanted for dinner, if she needed a ride to a checkup. But Eleanor had never responded with kindness. In her eyes, Ava was just a poor girl who got lucky marrying her son, a childless, statusless, valueless woman. But now, that very woman held the $25 million that could decide the life or death of the Hayes Company. She gripped her phone, a lump of pride and desperation rising in her throat. Eleanor had never thought she would have to beg her former daughter-in-law, but if she didn't, the company could fail. Ethan stood by the window, silently looking out. Chloe paced the room. The tension was so thick that no one dared to speak above a whisper. Finally, Eleanor pressed the call button. The ringing echoed in the silent room, each second making her heart pound harder. Chloe whispered, "Mom, do you think she'll answer?" Ethan said nothing, just stared at the phone in his mother's hand. The phone rang a few more times, and then, click. The call connected. A familiar voice came through, calm and gentle. "Hello." The living room went silent. For 3 years, they had heard that voice thousands of times, but it had never sounded so distant. Eleanor's throat was tight for a few seconds, unsure how to begin. Ava spoke again. "Is something wrong?" Her voice was still polite, but it lacked the warmth it once had. The distance was palpable. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Ava," she said her name, a name she had always said with a cold tone, but this time her voice was softer. "Where are you?" The other end was silent for a moment before Ava replied simply, "Is there something you need?" Eleanor clenched her fist. "The company is having some problems." Chloe's eyes widened. She had never heard her mother speak to Ava so gently, but Ava's voice remained even. "What does that have to do with me?" The simple question made Eleanor freeze. For 3 years, Ava had always said, "Our house, our company." But today, she said, "Your company," drawing a clear line. Eleanor tried to remain calm. "Ava, about the investment fund, can you meet with me?" The line was silent for a few seconds. Then Ava asked, "What for?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. A proud woman like her was not used to explaining herself. But this time, she had to. "We need to talk." A long pause. Then Ava replied, "All right, just one word. Where?" Eleanor let out a breath of relief. "Tomorrow. At the house." But Ava immediately said, "No." Eleanor paused. "Then where would you like to meet?" Ava's response was clear. "My office." The words silenced the room. My office. 3 simple words that reminded them of one thing. Ava was no longer a daughter-in-law of the Hayes family. She didn't have to step into that house, didn't have to listen to their commands, didn't have to bow her head to anyone. Eleanor struggled to keep her voice steady. "All right. What's the address?" Ava replied. "I'll send it to you tomorrow." Then she paused, her voice still calm. "But before we meet, there's one thing I want to make clear." Eleanor felt her heart clench. "What is it?" Ava spoke slowly. "You don't need to explain, and you don't need to apologize." The statement stunned Eleanor, but the next sentence sent a chill down all 3 of their spines. "Because I have no intention of coming back." With that, the call ended. Beep. 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 The short sound echoed in the living room. Eleanor was still holding the phone. Chloe's voice trembled. Mom, what did she mean by that? Ethan looked down at the floor, a complex feeling rising within him, not just worry for the company, but a deep, profound regret. For the first time, he realized something. The woman he had thought was weak had never actually needed the Hayes family. And now, perhaps, they were the ones who needed her. At the same time, on the top floor of the Thompson Capitol building, Ava put her phone down. Her assistant, standing nearby, asked, Miss Thompson, they will be here tomorrow. Ava nodded. Yes. The assistant hesitated. Are you going to help them? Ava looked out the window. Below, the city was still a brilliant tapestry of light. 3 years ago, she thought the Hayes family would be her home for life. Now, it all felt like a dream from which she had awakened. She spoke softly. Whether I help them or not, they'll find out tomorrow. The next morning, the sky over New York was unusually clear. Early sunbeams struck the skyscrapers, making their glass facades sparkle like giant mirrors. In front of the Thompson Capitol building, a black Mercedes pulled to a stop. The door opened, and Eleanor Hayes stepped out first. She looked up at the 30-story tower before her. At the very top, large, gleaming steel letters spelled out Thompson Capitol. Eleanor swallowed hard. For 3 years, she had never heard Ava mention this place. If it weren't for yesterday's investigation, she would still believe her former daughter-in-law was just an ordinary girl. Chloe got out next, her eyes wide as she took in the luxurious lobby. Marble floors gleamed. The ceiling soared high above, adorned with massive crystal chandeliers. Employees in sharp suits moved with quiet efficiency. This place was a world away from any of Hayes Enterprises' offices. Ethan was the last to get out. He tilted his head back to look at the building, a strange feeling stirring inside him. 3 years. 3 years he had lived with Ava, yet he never knew she belonged to a world like this. The 3 of them entered the lobby. A receptionist immediately bowed her head. Good morning. How may I help you? Eleanor said, We have an appointment with Ava Thompson. The receptionist smiled. Yes, Miss Thompson is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the 28th floor. The term Miss Thompson made Eleanor flinch. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. No one spoke. Only the soft whir of the machine filled the silence. Chloe whispered, Mom, do you think she'll help us? Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't know. The elevator stopped. The doors slid open to a long hallway with gray carpeting and glass-walled offices on either side. At the end of the hall was a large set of double doors with a plaque that read, Chief Executive Officer. An assistant was waiting for them. Right this way, please. The doors opened, and the 3 of them stepped inside. The office was vast, flooded with sunlight from a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. In the center of the room was a large, modern desk, and sitting behind it was Ava Thompson. She wore a simple, cream-colored suit, her hair tied back neatly. Her expression was calm, stripped of the gentle, submissive look she wore at the Hayes' home. Instead, there was the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to power. Ethan froze for a moment. He almost didn't recognize the woman in front of him, but Ava just looked at them, her gaze perfectly composed. Please, have a seat. Her voice was soft but clear. The 3 of them sat down. No one spoke first. Finally, it was Eleanor who broke the silence. Ava, her voice was hoarse. How have you been? The simple question was so out of place that Chloe almost laughed. In 3 years, her mother had never once asked that. Ava replied curtly, I'm fine. She no longer called her mom, just a polite, detached response. Eleanor bit her lip. Ava, about the company. Before she could finish, Ava gently placed a file on the desk. This is the latest financial report for Hayes Enterprises. Eleanor paused. You already know? Ava looked at her. I've known for a while. Ethan frowned. For how long? Ava nodded. As soon as the fund's protection clause was activated, She opened the file to a specific page. Currently, Hayes Enterprises is short approximately $40 million to maintain cash flow. Chloe's eyes widened. You know all of this? Ava gave a small smile. The banks are all my partners. The statement silenced all three of them. Eleanor clenched her fists. Ava, can you help the company? It was a sentence she never thought she would have to say in her 20 years of power, a plea for help, but Ava didn't answer right away. She looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. I can help. The three of them immediately looked at her. Chloe almost sighed in relief. But Ava's next words left them stunned. But I have one condition, Eleanor asked quickly. What condition? Ava turned back to them, her gaze chillingly calm. Hayes Enterprises must be sold to Thompson Capital. The room fell silent. 1 second, 2, 3. Chloe jumped to her feet. What? Eleanor's face turned pale. You want to buy the company? Ava nodded. Yes. Her voice was steady. In return, I will inject the capital needed to save it. Ethan stared at her, his eyes holding not anger, but a vague, aching pain. And what happens after that? Ava looked directly at him, her answer simple. Then you become an employee. The words landed like a knife. The man who had been her husband, the vice president of Hayes Enterprises, would now be nothing more than an employee. Eleanor shot to her feet. Never, she screamed. That is my family's company. But Ava just looked at her, her expression unchanged. You can refuse. She closed the file. But in 2 months, your company will be bankrupt. A heavy silence descended upon the room, because for the first time, the Hayes family realized something. The power to decide was no longer in their hands. In the vast CEO's office of Thompson Capital, the atmosphere was so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows, falling upon the desk where Ava Thompson sat. She remained perfectly calm, a stark contrast to the three people seated across from her. Eleanor Hayes was still standing, stunned by Ava's proposal. Never. She was breathing heavily. That company belongs to my family. Ava didn't react, her gaze so placid it only fueled Eleanor's anger. Chloe turned to her brother. Ethan, say something! But Ethan remained seated. His hands were flat on the table, his eyes fixed on the file. His mind was in turmoil. He understood one thing very clearly. What Ava proposed was entirely possible. Right now, his family had no other source of funding. If Thompson Capital didn't intervene, Hayes Enterprises would indeed collapse. Eleanor turned back to Ava, her eyes filled with fury. You're doing this for revenge, aren't you? Ava's brow furrowed slightly. Revenge? She repeated the word as if considering it. After a moment, she shook her head. No. Her voice was very soft. I'm just doing business. The answer left Eleanor speechless. 3 years ago, when the Hayes family accepted the $25 million investment, that too was a business transaction. But at the time, they never imagined the tables would one day be turned so completely. Chloe suddenly stood up. Don't pretend. You're doing this because you hate my mother. Ava looked at her, not with anger, but with a cool detachment. Is that what you think? Chloe crossed her arms. Isn't it? For 3 years in our house, you always acted so weak. Now you're finally showing your true colors. The accusation hung in the silent room. Ava looked at Chloe for a few seconds, then she slowly rose from her chair. She walked away from her desk, toward the great glass wall overlooking the city sprawling below. 3 years. 3 years, as a daughter-in-law in the Hayes family. Memories flooded her mind. The dinners where she had to clear the table while the rest of the family sat and talked. The times Eleanor criticized her in front of relatives. The evenings she sat alone in a large room while Ethan came home late without a word. And all the moments she was made to feel like an outsider in the house she lived in. Ava turned back, a flicker of emotion finally showing in her eyes. Do you know why I never said anything for 3 years? No one answered. She continued. Because I thought family was a place that could change people, that if I was patient enough, things would get better. She gave a faint, sad smile. But I was wrong. The room was silent. Eleanor was still standing, but the fury in her eyes had begun to waver. Ava looked directly at her. Do you remember the day I first came to your house? Eleanor said nothing. Ava went on. That day, you said something to me. She paused, then repeated the words. In this house, from the chair you sit on to the glass you drink from, it all belongs to the Hayes family. Chloe flinched slightly. Her mother had indeed said that, but at the time, they never thought Ava would remember. Ava gave a slight nod. I remember it very clearly. I've remembered it for 3 years. She walked back to her desk and placed a hand on the file. So today, you all should understand something too. She looked at them, her voice calm but firm. In business, there are no feelings. There is only value. The words made the air even heavier. Eleanor's voice trembled. Ava, do you really want to see the company go bankrupt? Ava didn't answer immediately. She looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, I've already given you a choice. Eleanor bit her lip, her hands shaking. In her entire life, she had never bowed her head to anyone. But now, her family's company, her husband's legacy, her son's career, it was all in the hands of the woman before her. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds passed. Then, something no one in the room expected happened. Eleanor Hayes knelt on the floor. Chloe gasped. Mom! Ethan shot to his feet. Mom! But Eleanor remained on her knees. Tears streamed down her face, her voice shaking. Ava, I'm begging you. The room was stunned into silence. For 3 years, this woman had never called Ava daughter. But today, she did, only to plead. Save the company. Save this family. She bowed her head. I was wrong. Ethan stood motionless. He had never seen his mother so broken. As for Ava, she stood watching the woman who had scorned her for 3 years kneel before her. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, profound calm. She spoke very softly. Get up. Eleanor shook her head. If you don't help us, I won't get up. The room was silent. Then Ava said something that astonished them all. You don't have to kneel. She looked at them, her voice gentle but clear. I already told you I would save the company. The 3 of them looked up, but her next sentence left them frozen once more. But my condition remains the same. Hayes Enterprises will be sold to Thompson Capital. Silence fell again, because they all understood. This time, Ava wasn't their daughter-in-law. She was the one who decided their fate. The oppressive atmosphere in the CEO's office of Thompson Capital lingered. Eleanor Hayes was still on her knees, her trembling hands clasped in front of her, her eyes red with tears. Chloe stood behind her, utterly speechless, having never witnessed her mother in such a state of vulnerability. Ethan remained standing, watching his mother kneel before the woman who was once his wife, a knot of shame and pain tightening in his chest. Ava stood behind her desk, her gaze on Eleanor devoid of anger or satisfaction, only a profound calm that was impossible to read. She spoke softly. Please, get up. Eleanor shook her head. If you don't help, I won't get up. It was the second time she had called Ava daughter, but the word was no longer an assertion of authority from a mother-in-law. It was a plea. Ethan stepped forward. Mom, get up. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but she refused to move. Ava, I'm begging you. The room fell silent. After a long moment, Ava sighed softly. She walked around her desk and stood before Eleanor. She bent down and took her hands. Get up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Eleanor look up. Their eyes met. In 3 years, it was the first time they had looked at each other for so long. Finally, Eleanor shakily got to her feet and sank into a chair, her hands still trembling. Ava returned to her desk and opened the file. My condition is unchanged. Thompson Capital will acquire Hayes Enterprises. In exchange, I will provide the capital to save the company. Chloe said angrily. You're being unreasonable. We've humbled ourselves this much already. But Ethan raised a hand to stop his sister. Chloe, that's enough. Chloe was taken aback by the tone of his voice. It wasn't anger, but the sound of someone who had reached a point of understanding. Ethan looked at Ava for a long time, memories flooding his mind. 3 years ago, on their wedding day, Ava wore a simple white dress. She had stood beside him, smiling gently. After the ceremony, she had asked him, "Do you have any regrets?" He had laughed. "I'm only afraid you'll have regrets." But now, the one with the most regret was him. Ethan stepped closer to the desk. "I want to ask you something." Ava looked at him. "Go ahead." Ethan took a deep breath. "For the past 3 years, why didn't you tell me the truth?" The question silenced the room. Ava looked at him. After a moment, she replied, "Do you think things would have been different if I had?" Ethan was speechless. In his heart, he knew she was right. Things would have likely been the same. The problem was never about money. It was about how they had treated her. Ethan clenched his fists and said something he had never said in 3 years. "I'm sorry." The room went still. Chloe stared at him in disbelief. Even Eleanor looked up. Ethan had never apologized to anyone, but this time, he lowered his head. "I'm sorry." His voice was low. "For 3 years, I never once stood by your side." Ava looked at him, her expression wavering for a fraction of a second before returning to a calm composure. "That doesn't matter anymore." Ethan gave a bitter smile. "Maybe not to you, but it matters to me." He glanced around the office. "I used to think divorce was a form of liberation." He paused, then continued. "But now I realize I was the biggest fool in our marriage." His words left Chloe speechless, and Eleanor bowed her head. She knew that if she hadn't pushed her son into the divorce, things might have been very different. Ava closed the file. "Let's get back to business," she said. "My time is limited." Ethan looked at her. "I agree." The room was stunned. Chloe cried out, "Ethan," but he continued, "I agree to sell Hayes Enterprises to Thompson Capital." Eleanor looked up. "Ethan, son." Ethan turned to his mother. "We don't have another choice." Then he looked back at Ava. "But I have one request." Ava raised an eyebrow. "What request?" Ethan said. "After the acquisition, let me continue to work there." He gave a slight smile. "Not as a vice president, just as a regular employee." The room was silent. Ava studied him for a long time. Then she said something that surprised everyone. "You don't have to be an employee." Ethan paused. "What do you mean?" Ava looked at him. "After Thompson Capital takes over, I will need someone who understands the company inside and out," she continued. "You will remain as president." Ethan was stunned. "You trust me?" Ava smiled faintly. "No," she said bluntly. "I trust your competence." The answer was practical and brutally clear. Ethan stood still. A storm of emotions churned inside him. Perhaps this was the first time he truly understood the woman before him, but sadly, it was too late. Yet, the story wasn't over, because after Thompson Capital acquired Hayes Enterprises, another secret within the Hayes family was about to be revealed, one that would be even more shocking than the $25 million. After the meeting at Thompson Capital, the tension in the room began to ease, though a heavy silence remained. On the desk, the acquisition agreement for Hayes Enterprises lay neatly between them. With a single signature, everything would change. Ethan sat across from Ava, staring at the document for a long time. 3 years ago, he had signed a marriage license with her. 3 years later, he was signing a contract that would completely alter the future of his family's company. He picked up the pen, but before signing, he asked, "Can I ask you one more question?" Ava looked up. "Go ahead." Ethan looked directly at her. "In the last 3 years, did you ever truly love me?" The question hung in the air. Chloe, standing behind him, frowned. Eleanor also looked up, but Ava didn't answer right away. She gazed out the large window behind her desk. The city below was a blur of motion, traffic flowing endlessly. After a moment, she spoke. "Yes." Just one word, but it made Ethan freeze. She continued, The day you proposed to me, I was so happy. A memory flickered in her eyes. That day, he had stood at her door with a huge bouquet of flowers. He had said, "I'm not as rich as other guys, but I'll do my best to give you a good life." She had believed him. She believed that as long as they tried, everything would be all right. But Ava sighed softly. "Love can't survive on its own." She looked at him. "For 3 years, you never once stood up for me." Ethan lowered his head. He couldn't argue, because it was true. There were so many times he had heard his mother say hurtful things to Ava, but he had always chosen silence. He thought that if he didn't make a scene, it would all just blow over. He never understood that his silence was what hurt her the most. Ava continued, "There's something I never told anyone." She opened a desk drawer, took out an envelope, and placed it on the table. "Take a look." Ethan picked it up. Inside was a medical report. He opened it, and a few seconds later, his hand began to shake. The report clearly stated the results of a 6-week pregnancy test. Ethan looked up, his voice cracking. You were pregnant?" The room seemed to freeze. Chloe gasped, and Eleanor was stunned into silence. For 3 years, they had all believed Ava couldn't have children because she had never become pregnant. But the paper in Ethan's hand proved otherwise. His voice trembled. "When did this happen?" Ava replied softly. "The 2nd year of our marriage." A painful memory crossed her face. The day she found out she was pregnant, she had been overjoyed. She wanted to tell Ethan the good news. But just then, she overheard a conversation between Eleanor and a relative in the living room. "If that girl has a child, she'll get a claim on the family fortune." The words were like a knife to the heart. In that moment, Ava understood that in her mother-in-law's eyes, her unborn grandchild was nothing more than a threat to their assets. Ethan clenched the paper. "So where is the baby?" Ava looked at him. Her gaze was calm, but her voice quivered slightly. "I lost it." The room went silent. Chloe whispered under her breath. "No way." But Ava continued. "That day, I heard what she said." She looked at Eleanor, not with blame or anger, just a deep, knowing stare. "That night, I started bleeding. The doctor said I was under extreme stress." She paused, then added, "After that, I couldn't get pregnant again." The paper fell from Ethan's hand. He stood motionless, as if all the strength had been drained from his body. For 3 years, he thought his wife didn't want children. Now he knew she had been pregnant, and he never even knew. Ethan stumbled back a step, his voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ava looked at him, a sad smile on her face. "Do you think you would have believed me?" Ethan couldn't answer. He knew that back then, he probably would have thought the same thing as his mother, that she was lying. The room was silent for a long time. Finally, Ava closed her file. "That's all in the past," she said gently. "Let's get back to the company." But Ethan just stood there, his hands shaking. Only one thought echoed in his mind. If he had stood by her that day, maybe their child would still be here, and maybe their marriage wouldn't have ended. Outside the window, the sun was climbing higher. A new day had begun. But for the Hayes family, this was just the beginning of the truth, because there was still one more secret to be told. After the revelation about the baby, a silence heavier than any before descended upon the CEO's office. No one spoke. No one dared to look at each other. There was only the sound of the wind whispering against the large glass windows. Ethan remained frozen, his hands on the desk, his eyes fixed on the crumpled pregnancy report. A single thought consumed him. He had lost a child he never knew he had. For 3 years, he had believed Ava didn't want to be a mother. He even once said something to her that he now recalled with searing shame. "If you don't want kids, just say so." But the truth was, she had been pregnant, and she had lost that child in complete solitude, with no one by her side. Ethan took a slight step back, his voice raw. "I didn't know." No one responded. He looked at Ava. Her expression was still calm, but that very calmness was more painful than any accusation. "I really didn't know," he repeated. Ava gave a slight nod. "I know," Just 2 words, devoid of blame or resentment. And that was what hurt Ethan the most. Because when someone no longer bothers to blame you, it means they no longer hold any hope for you. On the other side of the room, Eleanor Hayes had slumped into her chair, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God," she whispered, "it's my fault. 3 years ago, she was the one who had said those words. She was the one Ava had overheard. She was the one who had constantly pressured her. And now, she understood that her own words might have caused the death of her unborn grandchild." She began to sob, the strong, unyielding matriarch finally breaking down like a repentant sinner. "Ava, I was wrong," she bowed her head. "I was so wrong." But Ava just stood there. She didn't approach, didn't offer comfort. She just remained silent. Because some apologies, no matter how sincere, can never turn back time. After a long moment, Ava closed the file. "That's in the past." Her voice was gentle. "Let's get back to the company." Her practicality was almost jarring, but it was who she was now, no longer living in the past, only looking forward. She pushed the contract toward Ethan. "Sign it." Ethan looked at the paper, then at her. After a moment, he picked up the pen and signed his name. With that single signature, Hayes Enterprises officially belonged to Thompson Capital. But strangely, it didn't feel like a defeat. At least the company was saved. After signing, Ethan put the pen down. He looked at Ava one last time. "Thank you." Ava didn't reply. He continued, "Not for the company, but for giving me a chance to make things right." Ava looked at him and said very softly, "You don't owe me anything. We're over." A simple sentence that closed the final door. Ethan nodded. He understood. Some things, once lost, can never be brought back. A month later, Hayes Enterprises was officially a subsidiary of Thompson Capital. Under the new management, the company quickly stabilized. Ethan remained as president, but he approached his work with a completely different attitude. The arrogance and complacency were gone. He began to listen to his employees, to take responsibility, to become the man he should have been all along. As for Eleanor, after everything that had happened, she changed dramatically. She sold the old mansion and moved into a smaller house. The lavish parties and boastful talk were gone, replaced by an old woman slowly learning to live with humility. Chloe also went abroad to continue her studies. The Hayes family was no longer the dazzling dynasty it once was, but they had finally learned the value of the things they had once taken for granted. And Ava Thompson? One afternoon, she stood on the rooftop terrace of the Thompson Capital building. A gentle breeze swept through her hair as she looked down at the bustling city below. Her assistant approached. "Miss Thompson, Hayes Enterprises has stabilized." Ava nodded. "Good," the assistant asked. "Do you have any regrets?" Ava gazed out at the cityscape. After a moment, she shook her head slightly. "No, because the past 3 years had taught her an important lesson. Some people come into your life to bring you happiness. Others come into it only to teach you how to grow. The Hayes family had been her greatest lesson, but after everything, she no longer felt any hatred, only a sense of peace." Ava smiled, a very faint, serene smile. The sun began to set in the distance. An old chapter had closed, and a new one in her life was just beginning. The lesson from this story is profound, touching on family, humanity, and how we treat one another. First, never judge people by their appearance or circumstances. For 3 years, Ava lived a simple, patient, and enduring life. The Hayes family mistook her for a weak and poor woman, constantly looking down on her. In the end, the very person they scorned was the one who held the power to change their entire family's destiny. Life is full of surprises, and often, it is arrogance that leads to one's downfall. Second, in a marriage, silence can sometimes be more damaging than harsh words. Ethan wasn't a bad person, but he chose to remain silent when his wife was being hurt. That silence created an ever-widening chasm between them. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. In a family, Understanding and standing up for each other are what sustain long-lasting happiness. Third, words spoken carelessly can have devastating consequences. A single cruel remark from the mother-in-law, spoken in a moment of disdain, inflicted a deep wound on Ava, leading to the tragic loss of her unborn child. Therefore, in life, we must learn to think before we speak, because some words, once uttered, can never be taken back. And finally, life always gives us a chance to grow. In the end, every character in the story had to learn to change, to be more humble, to appreciate what they once had, and to live better for the future.